Okay. First of all, I just want to say, Sakaguchi-san, thank you for creating so many games that have impacted my life and the lives of many others. Growing up, I've read so many interviews from you with other people and just really respected and admired your work so much. So just thank you for creating games in general.
Thank
Hi.
you. Thank you.
Okay, so for my first question, this game is exclusive to Apple Arcade. How has working with Apple been like? Were they the first ones to approach you, if you can comment on that?
The development relationship with Apple, I would say, was really, really good, and almost 100% of the creative control was entrusted to me and my team. So I was able to make the game that I really wanted to. And interestingly, the Apple II was kind of the reason why I joined the game industry. It's quite an old unit, the Apple II. I played games like Wizardry and Ultima, and even this business software called VisiCalc, which is kind of the predecessor to a lot of spreadsheet software today. Everything was so new and fresh to me. It was a massive culture shock in a way. And that's when I realized I wanted to make something using computers in my career. And now that I'm kind of approaching the end of my development career, if you will, I think it's interesting that I'm able to finally work with Apple in this way. And as far as the approach, coincidentally, there were two members inside of Apple who were big Uematsu and Final Fantasy fans, and they were kind of at the inception or startup of Apple Arcade, and we would have dinner occasionally, and during one of these dinners they said, hey, there's this new platform, it's an exciting platform, do you want to do something together? And that's how the sort of partnership began.
Fantasian's dioramas remind me of the pre-rendered backgrounds of the PlayStation 1 era Final Fantasy games. How do you feel this new approach differs from the ones back then? Is it easier to create backgrounds this way?
Fantasian, as you pointed out, features a lot of dioramas, and ironically it was in a weird way kind of double the work in terms of the workflow or pipeline. And a lot of this is because once we created these dioramas, these physical dioramas, we would then take hundreds of photos of the diorama, which would then be rendered into a 3D kind of polygon model. And most of the 3D scanning technology wasn't really applicable. So we had to use a different pipeline that cities use. The cities would fly drones through their cities and take a lot of photographs and then construct models of their city. So we used a similar photo processing pipeline as they would to create this 3D model, which would retain a lot of the details of the dioramas that other methods would kind of lose. And once we have this 3D data, we couldn't simply apply the textures on because it wouldn't have that same type of feel that you get when you're looking at these dioramas in person. So separately, we had to take the dioramas to a studio, light them up, and then take professional photographs of them. And those photographs are finally projection mapped onto the 3D models, which results in ultimately the kind of visual that you see. And because we have the 3D models, finally the characters are going to be able to move and walk and interact and kind of collide with the environment. So in that respect, it was a very complex pipeline, but I think it really is reminiscent of a lot of old Final Fantasy camera angles with regards to how the camera transitions and the angles at which you get to see the environment. Although the method to how we got there was a lot more involved, shall we say. But I think the final result is a very, very unique visual style that we had envisioned. So I feel it was worth it.
Oh, awesome. That sounds like significantly more work. Having spent over 3 decades creating some of the most acclaimed titles in gaming, what elements do you find most important when creating a high-quality RPG?
I've created, as you mentioned, a lot of games, I think, in my career, and not all of them, I would say, are fully complete, and there are some things I felt I left on the table, and maybe regrets if you want to go that far. But why that's the case, or what really kind of contribute to a really complete experience, I feel there are 2 points specifically. First is really the game design and the experience from a very early stage of development. My development style, I start by writing the scenario, kind of the story outline of the entire game. And while I do that, I include some game design elements or some beats where I want there to be gameplay inserted. So it's a very unique kind of scenario to my development style and pipeline. But in doing so, we really have to kind of flesh out the entire experience. Otherwise, you're going to run into trouble along the way if you don't figure out certain things during this scenario phase. And it's like buttoning your shirt. If you miss a button, you're going to button everything subsequently after that slightly off, and it's not going to feel like a very complete experience. So one is really getting that scenario, nailing it down, getting it right. The other is almost this kind of brute force or guts, if you will. You really have to take things on, and in our case, it is really the attention to detail, and a lot of details of these worlds help complete the experience and build out the world. So we want to make sure when the player does certain things, that there is some kind of interaction that the world, some kind of feedback the world gives back. And it's the accumulation of these small details that I think really completes the experience. So, I would want to speak generally. I don't know if that's the universal answer to making good RPGs, but on a more personal level, that's what I always try to improve and try to tackle when I'm developing RPGs.
I believe you mentioned Final Fantasy VI as a source of inspiration for Fantasian. What was so special about Final Fantasy VI for you? It's also one of my favorites as well.
You're correct. In other interviews, I think I mentioned playing Final Fantasy VI on this live broadcast program with some of the development members of the time together was really what reminded me of what I liked about this genre and led to the creation of Fantasian. And calling out Final Fantasy VI specifically, I think it had to do somewhat with the sort of pixel art nature, where there wasn't a lot of ways where we can add performances or add expressions to this world or these characters. And it's like when you're reading a novel, there's this sort of room for the readers or whoever's consuming the content. There's room for their imagination. So whether it's the world that you're painting or certain characters' expressions, I think there's some similarities with how you experience that novel with how this game is kind of depicting the story. And for example, be it the acting, let's say there's only so many gestures or actions that could be done in the pixel art era. Like the characters can either bow or they can clap a little bit, and that would have to be the extent of their performance through which you would depict a story. And that gap, I think, is what gives the audience that room to insert their imagination and really kind of feel like they're part of the experience. So having seen that in Final Fantasy VI, I wanted to see what that might look like using today's technology. And I think that was a big source of where Fantasian came from. And if you've played Fantasian, you'll notice a lot of the characters acting leaves that similar room of interpretation or room to kind of experience it yourself. And it's almost like this puppet show where the actions and gestures are quite limited. Likewise, the memories or the novels, these kind of, how do you call them? The novel sections of the games that are inserted kind of flashback on certain memories of different characters. Again, the reader has to read it while they're experiencing the music and the visuals. So it leaves this, you can call it negative space, where the player or the consumer has to be part of. And I felt Final Fantasy VI had a lot of that, and I wanted to recreate that feeling.
That was one of my favorite things about the older Final Fantasies, actually, is that space where you had to insert your imagination into it and let some of the interactions play out in your head. You stated before that this may be your last game. Looking back at your incredible portfolio of work, what are some of the most important lessons you've learned about creating games as a game developer?
I think it's the people, and that's really, really important. The kind of team you can put together when developing these games and taking on a challenge. And oftentimes it's how these people feel and the direction they want to go. It might not always be the same, but most importantly, it's their attitude towards the game, their attention to detail, their passion to convey something through this game medium. That's what I think really translates into the experiences you see through the screen. And really gathering that team for me is one of the most important aspects of game development. And in most cases, especially this one, I would be the leader of this team, so I would need them to trust my decisions and trust my process. And at the same time, I would need to trust these team members to the roles with which they're intended to fulfill, so they can really put their 100% into the game and invest that power into what they're creating. And when you have teams of people, of course, communication becomes a big aspect of it. And really communicating with people takes a lot of time. And at certain times, there's going to be conflicts or different junctions where we might not see eye to eye. But I think overcoming that and creating something really is what makes it really powerful. And these chance encounters, I've been really lucky with all the meetings and encounters with different people and wonderful people in the industry throughout my career, which has helped me get me to where I am today. So that is what I believe helped me make so many games throughout my years in the industry.
Amazing. Awesome. I think that's it for my questions here. Again, Sakaguchi-san, thank you so much for taking your time out to talk to me. It has been a dream come true for me. When I started creating videos for YouTube, I pretty much never thought I would have any chance of ever being able to speak to you, and here I am. And again, thank you just so much.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much.
Shout out to patron Liam Bolton and the rest of the Ultima community.
Toku